The cruelest thing in this world is not a slap across the face. It is a joke, the kind of joke arranged with patience, with care, designed for one purpose only, to crush the last shred of dignity a human being has left. That night, in the worst blizzard of a Chicago winter, Patrice Whitmore pushed her almost daughter-in-law, 5 months pregnant, into a taxi. The destination: the black iron gates of a man whose name the city's elite only dared to whisper. They called him the Devil of the Chicago Docks. Tucked inside the pocket of her worn coat was an envelope, sealed with the crimson wax of the Whitmore estate. She was forbidden to open it. She did not know that the words inside had already sold her out in a way crueler than anything she could imagine. Beyond those gates, a photographer had been paid in full. He sat hunched in his car, lens aimed through the falling snow, waiting for a single moment, a pregnant woman thrown out into the white. By morning, the whole city would have something to laugh about over coffee. Her name would be buried before her child ever drew its first breath. That was the script. A script perfect down to the last detail, except for one thing no one had counted on. The man with the scarred hands read the letter to its final line. Not a muscle moved in his face. Then he dropped the page into the fire and stood in silence, watching it curl into ash. And when he turned to his butler, the whole room seemed to stop breathing at the words of the most ruthless man in Chicago. "Bring her warm milk. She's carrying a child." If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories still waiting to be told. The study smelled of old paper and wood smoke, and Margot Ellison sat in a leather chair that was worth more than everything she had owned in the last year, holding a cup of warm milk between both hands, like a woman holding the only proof that she was not dreaming. Her coat was still dripping. Her shoes had left dark stains on a rug that probably came from another century, and somewhere beneath her ribs, 5 months along, her child shifted gently, as if it too was waiting to see what would happen next. She did not drink at first. She only held the cup, feeling the heat crawl into her frozen fingers, and stared at the man behind the great oak desk, trying to understand why she was still inside this house, instead of face down in the snow. Cormac Byrne did not look like the devil the city whispered about. He looked worse, because he looked calm. He was a tall man in a plain white shirt, with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his forearms were marked with old scars, thin, pale lines that told stories no one had ever dared to ask about. One scar climbed from his collarbone up the side of his neck, stopping just below the jaw, the kind of mark a man carries when something meant to kill him missed by a breath. His eyes were gray, but not the soft gray of rain. They were the gray of Lake Michigan in the dead of January, a frozen surface with something vast and patient moving underneath. On his wrist he wore an old watch, scratched and dull, a working man's watch, strange against the quiet wealth of the room. And for some reason, that watch unsettled her more than the scars did. Rich men wore rich things. This man wore a memory. She thought of what she had heard while waiting in the hall, and her hands tightened around the cup. The butler had left her on a bench outside these doors, and through the heavy wood she had heard a man's voice begging. Not arguing. Begging. Something about a shipment that came in short, about how it would never happen again, about his family. And then another voice had answered, low and even, with no anger in it at all. A voice that sounded like a man reading numbers off a page. "You have 1 week to leave Chicago," the voice had said, "by one road or another." That was all. No shouting. No threats she could name. Just that flat, patient sentence. And then the doors had opened, and a man in an expensive suit had walked past her with a face the color of ash, moving like someone who had just been shown his own grave. That was the voice now asking her to drink her milk before it went cold. She drank. It was rich and sweet, and it hit her empty stomach like mercy itself. And she hated how grateful her body was, how loudly it betrayed her hunger to this stranger. Cormac watched her without hurry. He let the fire crack twice in the silence before he spoke. "I read the letter," he said. "I want to hear one thing from you, and I want it plain. Did you know what was written in it when she put it in your pocket?" Margot set the cup down on the small table beside her, wiped her lips with the back of her hand, and answered the way she had once answered auditors and board members in rooms full of men waiting for her to stumble. "No," she said. "I was given a sealed envelope this evening and instructed to deliver it unopened. I was told you were hiring someone to manage accounts. I believed that was a lie before the taxi reached the end of her street. I came anyway." He tilted his head slightly. "Why?" "Because I have $47 to my name," she said. Because the last 3 doors I knocked on were closed by people Patrice Whitmore had already called. Because whatever was waiting behind your gate, it could not be worse than another night deciding which of us eats, me or the child. I assumed you would read the letter, throw me out, and I budgeted for that. I did not budget for the milk. Her voice did not shake. She had promised herself years ago that it never would again, not in front of anyone, and she kept her promises even when they were only to herself. Cormac studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies a locked door he was told would be open. Most people who sat in that chair filled the air with tears or flattery. This woman gave him line items. Something that was not quite a smile touched the corner of his mouth and was gone. "You speak like a ledger," he said. "I used to be paid well for it," she answered. He rose from the desk then, crossed to the fire, and stood with his back to her, the light carving shadows along the scar on his neck. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that she almost leaned forward to catch it. "Tell me something, Miss Ellison," he said. "Do you have any idea who the Whitmore family owes money to?" And Margot, who had spent her whole life being the one who found the numbers no one wanted found, went very still. The question hung in the warm air between them, and Margot searched his face for the trap in it, because in her experience questions from powerful men were always doors that locked behind you. "I assumed they owed everyone," she said carefully. "The dressmakers, the country club, half the contractors on the North Shore." Cormac turned from the fire, and there was something almost like appreciation in those winter-gray eyes. "Everyone," he agreed, "and one name more. 8 months ago, a private lending company extended the Whitmore estate a line of credit to keep its doors open and its charity galas photographed. That company has an address, a tax number, and a very forgettable name. What it actually has is me." He walked back to the desk and rested his knuckles on the wood. "The letter your mother-in-law wrote opens like a request for an extension on that debt. Very proper, very polished. And then, 3 paragraphs in, it changes its clothes. It offers me an asset against the balance. It offers me you." The room tilted slightly. Margot heard her own pulse in her ears, slow and heavy, like footsteps on a stair. She had walked through that iron gate believing she was the punchline of a cruel joke, a woman sent to be laughed at and thrown away. And the truth was uglier and simpler than that. Patrice had not sent her here to be humiliated. Patrice had sent her here to be spent. "Collateral," Margot said quietly, testing the word, the way a tongue tests a broken tooth. "That is why your gate opened tonight. Your man saw the Whitmore seal and thought it was about money." "It was about money," Cormac said. "You were the currency." She looked down at her hands, at the faint white line where a ring had briefly lived. And for one unguarded moment, the whole ruined year moved through her like weather. Wesley Whitmore had loved her. That much she still believed. Loved her in the careless, golden way of men who had never been told no, and for one bright spring she had let herself believe that stories like hers could end warm. She had been standing in a pharmacy holding the test that changed everything when her phone began to ring and would not stop. And by nightfall the news had a photograph of the wreckage of a small plane in a field outside Aspen and a caption with his name in it. She had gone to Patrice with the truth and an unborn grandchild, and Patrice had looked at her the way you look at mud on a white carpet. Within a month there was an accusation at the firm where Margot had built her name. Falsified figures found in an account she had never touched. A partner who suddenly could not meet her eyes. A security guard walking her to the street with a cardboard box. Within 2 months, there was a notice on her apartment door. The locks were changed while her clothes were still inside. She had sold her watch, then her coat, then her ring, and when she counted what was left of her life on the morning Patrice summoned her, it came to $47, and a child who deserved better than all of it. She said none of this aloud in the soft, broken voice of a victim. She said it the way she said everything, flat and exact, dates and amounts, cause and effect, a forensic account of her own destruction delivered without a single tear, and Cormac Byrne listened with his arms folded, and never once interrupted, never once arranged his face into sympathy. And somehow that was the kindest thing anyone had done for her in a year, because pity was just contempt wearing perfume, and he offered her none of it. When she finished, the fire had burned low on one side. He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "They accused you of inventing numbers," he said. "Yes." "Were the accusations true?" She met his eyes without blinking. "If I invented numbers, Mr. Byrne, I would not be sitting in your study with $47. I would be sitting on a beach with several million of theirs." The sound he made was short and rough, Less than a laugh, more than a breath. The sound of a man surprised by his own amusement, after a long time without it. He pulled open a drawer, set a thick green ledger on the desk between them, and turned it to face her. "Then answer me one more thing," he said, and his voice dropped into something quieter and more dangerous than the voice she had heard through the door. "How good are you with numbers? Not schoolbook good, not resume good. I am asking how deep you can read a page that was written to lie to you." And Margot looked at the ledger, then at the man, and understood that whatever happened in the next minute would decide the rest of her life. She opened the ledger because her hands wanted something to hold that was not fear, and she read it the way other women might read a letter from home, quickly, hungrily, her finger moving down the columns while the fire ticked in the grate. And after several minutes, she looked up and said, "Whoever kept this book was careless in March, and lying by June. The freight costs on the second page are rounded to even dollars. Real invoices never round that cleanly." And Cormac Byrne closed the ledger with one hand and made her an offer with the other. "You will stay at Ravenhill," he said. "You will keep my books. I will pay you 3 times what your old firm paid you. A room of your own in the East Wing. Meals. A doctor for the child when the time comes. In exchange, I get your eyes on every page I choose to show you." Margot heard the sentence inside the sentence and named it aloud, because she had learned the hard way that unspoken terms were the ones that ruined you. "Every page you choose to show me," she repeated. "Not every page you have." His expression did not change. "You will see the books of my legitimate businesses," he said. "The clubs, the warehouses, the trucking lines, the restaurants. Clean money with clean paper. Nothing else. You think I hand my whole house to a woman the Whitmores mailed to me in an envelope. You are being shown the front parlor, Miss Ellison. We will see how you clean it first." There were rules, and he gave them to her the way a man gives directions to a driver. Flat and final. She would not ask about the doors that stayed closed. She would not wander the north wing. She would not leave the grounds alone, not because she was a prisoner, he said, but because the name Byrne made certain people curious, and curiosity in his world did not knock first. She weighed all of it, the salary, the room, the locked doors, the child under her heart who had gone still and calm as if listening. And she said yes before the fire finished settling, because pride was a luxury, and she had pawned her luxuries months ago. What followed was a house waking up around her. The butler who had opened the gate appeared without being called. A lean gray man named Eamon Doyle, with a face like a headstone and eyes that catalogued her from shoes to collar in one pass. And when Cormac said she stays, Eamon answered very good and asked no questions at all, which told Margot more about the order of this house than any speech could have. A broad, handsome dog the size of a small bear came off the hearth rug with a rumble low in its chest, and she stood very still while it circled her. And Cormac said, without looking up from his desk, "Easy, Ozzy. She is the new bookkeeper. You bite her and you can do the taxes yourself." And the great animal sighed like a disappointed old man and lay back down. A housekeeper called Mrs. Pruitt arrived to show her upstairs, a stout woman with iron-colored hair and a mouth that gave away nothing, who walked her down a paneled hall, opened a door on a warm room with a made bed, said breakfast is at 8, and the boiler knocks twice before the heat comes, so do not be alarmed, and left before Margot could thank her. Alone, Margot sat on the edge of the bed in her damp coat and waited for the catch, the shout, the knock that meant it had all been a joke after all, and no knock came. There was only snow ticking at the window, and warmth rising through the floor, and she slept that night with both hands over her belly and did not dream. Across the city, in a breakfast room the color of cream, Patrice Whitmore was lifting her tea when the message arrived from a number her phone did not know, and she read it twice before her fingers forgot what they were holding. The gift is very satisfactory. She stays. C. B. The cup broke against the saucer's edge, and tea spread across the linen like a stain across a reputation. And outside the gates of Ravenhill, a photographer, who had waited the whole night in a cold car, with a long lens and an empty memory card, finally started his engine and drove home with nothing. And that was the last anyone ever saw of him. But in the cream-colored breakfast room, Patrice Whitmore sat very still among the ruins of her tea and her script, and anyone who knew her well would have seen the truth in the set of her jaw, because women like Patrice did not accept losing. They only postponed it, and somewhere behind those pale eyes a new and uglier plan had already begun to move. The books arrived at her desk the next morning in 3 towering stacks, The accounts of the nightclubs and the trucking line and the cold storage warehouses down at the docks. Years of paper bound in green leather, and Margot Ellison went into them the way some people go into churches. Quietly, completely, with her whole soul. She worked at a small desk Eamon had set up in the corner of the study, and for days the only sounds in that room were the scratch of her pencil, the crackle of the fire, and the occasional heavy sigh of Ozzy shifting his weight across Cormac's boots. She barely noticed the days themselves. What she noticed were the numbers, because the numbers were whispering, and by the fourth evening they were speaking plainly, and what they said had a name attached to it. Artie Kessler, the chief accountant who had vanished from his position weeks before she arrived. The man whose careless March and lying June she had spotted in a single reading that first night, had not been careless at all. He had been patient. She found the scheme buried in the maintenance ledgers of the cold storage warehouses. Refrigeration repairs billed month after month, compressor replacements, coil cleanings, emergency service calls in the middle of summer. All of it paid promptly to a contracting company, with a bland name and a post office box. And when she traced the registration of that company through the state filings, she found it belonged to a man who shared a last name with Kessler's wife. Her pencil stopped moving. Her heart did not. She spent one more full day rebuilding 4 years of invoices, and when the picture was complete, she carried a single sheet of paper across the study and set it in front of Cormac Byrne without a word. He read it. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at her the way opposing counsel looks at a surprise witness. "Walk me through it," he said, "and understand that I will be trying to tear it apart." She stood on the other side of his desk, with her hands folded over the curve of her belly, and delivered it like testimony. "Your warehouses have paid a company called Lakeline Mechanical over $2 million across 4 years for refrigeration maintenance. The invoices are perfect. Too perfect. Real repair bills have odd amounts, parts and labor, taxes that come out uneven. These are round figures, evenly spaced, growing about 8% a year, which is not how machines break, Mr. Byrne. It is how budgets are written." He countered without raising his voice. "Machines in constant use need constant service." She shook her head once. "Your compressors were replaced under warranty 2 years ago. It is in your capital ledger in Kessler's own handwriting. Yet Lakeline billed you for servicing the old units 11 times after the date they were hauled away as scrap." He tried again, quieter now, testing her the way ice tests a footstep. "Perhaps the contractor is simply a thief, and Kessler was fooled." "Then Kessler was fooled by his wife's brother," she said, "because that is who owns Lakeline. The registration is public, if you know which county to ask, and a chief accountant who can be fooled for 4 years by round numbers is not a man you would have kept for 10. The fire popped in the silence that followed. Cormac Byrne looked at the sheet of paper, then at the woman who had built it, and something shifted behind the frozen gray of his eyes, a kind of recognition. The look a man gives a blade he has just discovered is far sharper than the one he thought he bought, valuable and dangerous in the same breath. $2,140,000, he said slowly. "That is my count," she answered. "Give or take what he spent on being clever." He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the snow lying blue in the dark. That night, when Margot climbed the stairs with her spine aching and her ankles swollen, she found that the mattress in her room had been changed for a firmer one, with a pillow shaped to support a body carrying a child, and outside her door, on a small silver tray, sat a cup of warm milk, and no note came with it and no one ever mentioned it, and the next night it was there again. She stood in the hallway a long moment before she carried it inside, but sleep did not come easily, because a question had followed her up the stairs and sat itself at the foot of the new mattress, and it was the question she had not said aloud in the study. Artie Kessler had built himself a quiet fortune with round numbers and a brother-in-law, the kind of theft a greedy man nurses for decades. And yet, he had abandoned it all between 1 week and the next, left his office, his position, his slow golden goose, and disappeared without collecting so much as his final month of stolen money. Greedy men do not walk away from an open register. Greedy men run only when something has frightened them worse than losing everything. And lying in the dark with her hands resting over her child, Margot found herself asking the ceiling the question that would come to haunt the whole house before winter was done. What in God's name had Artie Kessler seen? The answer to that question was still days away, but trouble of a nearer kind arrived at the gates before the week was out, and it came wearing a wine-colored coat. Margot was crossing the great stone hall with a ledger under her arm when the front doors opened on a gust of cold, and a man she had hoped never to see again, Lyle Prescott, second cousin to Patrice Whitmore, a lawyer whose license had survived 3 decades of doing exactly this kind of errand. A thin man dressed 20 years too young for his face, with a leather folder under his arm, and the smile of a salesman who has already counted your money. "Margot, thank heaven," he announced to the whole hall, opening his arms as though she were a lost child found at a fairground. "The family has been sick with worry. Sick. Whatever this man has told you, whatever arrangement you think you have here, I am authorized to bring you home tonight." She did not move toward him. She noticed, in the corner of her vision, that Cormac had come to the study doorway and stopped there, leaning one shoulder against the frame, watching, saying nothing, and she understood with a strange, steadying warmth that he was not going to speak for her, that this floor was hers if she wanted it. Lyle unzipped the folder on the marble table by the door and produced papers with little colored tabs marking where a person was meant to sign away their life. "It is a simple document," he said, sliding a heavy pen across the table. "A release. You waive any claims, any interests, any entanglements with the Whitmore estate, on your own behalf and on behalf of," he paused delicately, "any dependents. In exchange, the family provides $20,000 in relocation assistance. A fresh start somewhere warm. Everyone walks away with their dignity." Margot looked at the pen, then at the man holding it, and when she spoke, her voice carried down the stone hall clear and level, the voice of a woman reading a verdict. "Tell Patrice this. I have employment. I have a salary that arrives on time, which is more than her own staff can say. I have a room where the heat works, and a doctor's appointment on the calendar, and my child has a name waiting, and none of those things are for sale at any price she can borrow. I am not signing your release, Mr. Prescott, and I am not going anywhere, and you may bill her for the gasoline." For a moment, the salesman's smile held its shape, and then it slid off his face like snow off a warm roof, and the man underneath was small and mean and tired. "You stupid, stubborn, gold-digging machine," he hissed, leaning across the table, all pretense gone. "You think you have won something. You have no idea what you are sitting on. You think that is a baby you are carrying." He laughed, a short, ugly sound that bounced off the stone. "That is a lottery ticket, sweetheart. And there are people in this city who will not let a lottery ticket walk around unclaimed." The words landed strangely, too big for the small man saying them, and even Lyle seemed to hear it, because his eyes flickered with something close to panic, the look of a card player who has shown one card too many. In the silence that followed, Cormac Byrne finally spoke from the doorway, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not move, and somehow that was worse. "Eamon," he said, "walk him to the gate before I change my mind." And from the shadow of the staircase came Eamon Doyle with his headstone face, and behind Eamon, rising off the hearth rug in the study with an unhurried, tectonic patience, came Ozzy, and the sound of those heavy claws clicking across the stone floor did the rest of the negotiating. Lyle Prescott gathered his papers with hands that no longer obeyed him, dropped his expensive pen, did not stop to pick it up, and was through the front doors before Eamon reached them, his wine-colored coat flapping down the steps into the dark like a wounded bird. The doors boomed shut. The hall settled. Margot let out a breath she had been holding since the folder opened, and found Cormac watching her with an expression she could not read. "You did well," was all he said, and he turned back into the study. But later that night, long after the house had gone quiet, the lamp in the study still burned, and Cormac Byrne sat alone with a telephone against his ear, speaking low to a man he paid to find paper that other people wanted lost, and the instruction he gave was simple. Pull every probate and notary filing connected to Wesley Whitmore. Wills, codicils, trusts, anything with his signature from the last 2 years of his life. Because gutter lawyers in borrowed coats did not invent phrases like lottery ticket on their own, and Cormac intended to learn exactly what number that ticket was carrying. While that search moved quietly through courthouse basements and notary archives, a different kind of change was moving through Ravenhill itself, so gradual that Margot could not have named the day it began. It showed itself in ledgers. The morning after Lyle Prescott fled down the front steps, a 4th stack of books appeared on her desk, the accounts of a restaurant group she had not been shown before, and a week later came a 5th, the payroll of a private security firm, and each new stack arrived without ceremony or explanation, simply there when she sat down, and she understood what they were, because she had spent her life reading what men did instead of what they said. Every ledger was a door, and Cormac Byrne was opening his house to her one room at a time, watching how she walked through each one before unlocking the next. She never asked for more than she was given. She never opened a drawer that was not hers. And the doors kept opening. Ozzy left his post on the hearthrug that same week and took up a new station beside her chair, a mountain of warm fur against her ankles, and no one in the house remarked on the treason. The evenings found a rhythm of their own, the two of them working in the same lamplight at opposite desks, sometimes for hours without a word, and the silence between them was nothing like the silence she had known in the Whitmore house, where quiet meant someone was listening at a door. This quiet was clean. It asked nothing of her. It was the silence of two people who had both survived something and did not require each other to perform recovery. Some nights he would ask her a question about a margin or a tax filing and she would answer without looking up, and some nights she would slide a page across to him with one figure circled and he would grunt and initial it, and that was the entire conversation. And she went up the stairs those nights feeling something she was careful not to examine too closely. Because naming a thing gives it the power to be taken away. It was on one of those nights, coming back down near midnight for a folder she had forgotten, that she saw him unguarded. The study door stood half open. Cormac was not at his desk. He was standing at the far wall, a glass in his hand, in front of a small, framed photograph she had never paid attention to. And she saw it clearly now past his shoulder, a picture taken decades ago on a bright day at the docks. A broad-shouldered man with dark hair laughing in front of the bow of a cargo ship, a man with Cormac's jaw and Cormac's eyes, and none of Cormac's winter in his face. She must have made some small sound, because he spoke without turning around, and his voice was lower than she had ever heard it. "My father," he said. He trusted the wrong man. That was all. He did not turn, and she did not ask. And after a moment she took her folder from the desk and went back up the stairs, and neither of them ever mentioned it. But she carried the picture with her anyway, the laughing man and the ship, and the son who stood in front of them both in the dark drinking alone, and she filed it in the place where she kept things that mattered. Then, on a gray afternoon in early December, the numbers began to whisper again. She was deep in the newest stack, the security firm's payroll and expense accounts, cross-checking them against the master disbursement ledger, when she felt it before she could point to it, the small wrongness, the pebble in the shoe of the page, and she stopped and went back and read the columns again more slowly. Money was moving in a pattern she had seen once already in this house, payments flowing out on schedule, clean and round and confident. But this time there was a difference, and the difference made no sense, and she sat very still while the lamp hummed and Ozzy breathed against her chair, working it through twice more to be certain. When Kessler had bled the warehouses, the money had flowed outward, away, into his brother-in-law's pocket and gone. This money was not flowing out. She traced the vendor payments through 2 shell names and a post office box, and the trail did not lead away from Ravenhill at all. It curved. It doubled back like a hallway in a dream. The money was flowing inward, into an account that paid regular sums to someone inside these walls, someone drawing a second salary the master books knew nothing about, and Margot lifted her eyes from the page and looked at the closed study door and felt the cold walk up her arms one vertebra at a time, because the arithmetic allowed only one conclusion. Whoever had frightened Artie Kessler out of his golden goose had not gone anywhere. The thief was still in the house. She decided she would bring it to Cormac in the morning, with the trail mapped and the shell names documented, because an accusation without proof was just noise, and in this house, noise could get a person hurt. It was the most careful decision she had made in years, and she never got the chance to act on it, because the trap that had been built for her sprang first. She came down the next morning to find the study door open, and the room full of a silence that had weight. Eamon Doyle standing beside the great oak desk with a thin folder in his hands and a face scrubbed of everything, and 2 of the house security men by the window not looking at her in the loud, deliberate way of men who have been told something. And Cormac Byrne seated behind the desk with his hands flat on the wood, and in front of him, laid out with terrible neatness, a single page of ledger paper and a printed sheet of what looked like message logs. No one offered her a chair. Eamon spoke first, and his voice was courteous and cold as a bank vault. "This page was found last night in the files Miss Ellison has been working," he said. "It is a disbursement record authorizing transfers from the household account to an outside address. The handwriting resembles hers, and this," he set the printed sheet beside it, "is a log pulled from the house network showing documents sent 3 nights ago to an email address registered to no one, from the terminal in the corner." Her terminal. The room tilted the way it had the night she learned she was collateral, but this was worse, because that night she had only been sold, and this morning she was being erased. She looked at the ledger page and felt the floor move, because the writing did resemble hers, the careful upright figures, the cross sevens she had used since college. Someone had studied her hand and built a forgery of her competence, and the message log sat beside it like a witness bought and paid for. She understood in one long, cold second how completely it had been done. The staff already knew. That was what the silence in the house had been this morning. The maid who had turned back up the stairs when she saw her, and she realized with a small distant ache that there had been no cup of milk outside her door last night. The first night it had not come, and no one had said a word. Because that is how houses convict people, not with trials but with withdrawn kindnesses. And through all of it, Cormac Byrne had not spoken. He sat with his hands flat on the desk, looking at the 2 sheets of paper, and Margot made herself look at him and only him, because whatever happened next would happen in his face first, and she watched him war with it. This man who had told her in 4 words in front of a photograph what trusting the wrong person had cost his family. This man who had been handed evidence, real physical evidence, against the stranger a Whitmore envelope had delivered to his gate 5 weeks ago. She saw the 2 roads open in front of him, and she saw that he saw them too, and the fire ticked, and Ozzy, shut out in the hall, scratched once at the door and went still, and the child under her heart rolled slowly as if turning in its sleep, and Margot Ellison stood in the middle of that beautiful frozen room with mud from the grave of her first ruined life still fresh in her memory, and waited to learn whether it had all just happened to her again. Cormac lifted his eyes from the paper. They gave her nothing. No warmth. No verdict. They were the lake in January all the way down, and when he finally spoke, he did not raise his voice, and he asked her exactly one question. "Did you do it?" And she answered him the only way she had ever answered anything, without flinching and without decoration. "No." The word stood alone in the room. He held her gaze for a long moment, and something moved far under the ice, too deep to name. And then he leaned back slowly in his chair and glanced once at the forged page, and when he looked back at her, his voice was quiet and even, and it contained, buried far down where only she could hear it, something that was almost a door left unlocked. "Then prove it," he said. "With the thing you are best at." He turned the ledger page around with one finger and slid it across the desk toward her. "Eamon will give you the file, the log, and the terminal. No one will help you, and no one will interfere." He looked at the window, where the sky over the lake was still black, and then back at her. And the last thing he said before the room emptied was not a threat, because he never needed threats. It was simply a clock. "You have until the sky over that water turns gray." They gave her the file and the log and the cold terminal in the corner, and they left her alone with them. And Margot Ellison did what she had done all her life when the world tried to bury her. She sharpened a pencil and went to work. She did not waste a minute weeping about the forgery. A forgery was just a document, and documents were her country, and every document ever made carries the fingerprints of the mind that made it. And somewhere on that page, the mind that hated her had left its prints. She read the fake disbursement entry 50 times. She read it until she stopped seeing her own imitated handwriting and started seeing the choices underneath it. And one by one, in the small hours while the house pretended to sleep, the choices began to confess. By the time the sky over the lake turned the color of iron, she had filled 6 sheets with her findings. And when Cormac Byrne walked into the study with Eamon behind him and the 2 security men taking their posts by the window, she was standing at the desk waiting for them with her spine straight and her evidence squared in a neat stack. And she began without being invited to begin. "This page is dated the 9th of November, she said, holding up the forged entry. "Look at the ledger code in the top corner. The house accounts were renumbered at the start of the fiscal year. Every genuine page since then carries the new prefix. I can show you 200 examples. This page carries the old one. Whoever wrote it copied the format from an archived book and did not know the system had changed, which means he never made a real entry in this house in his life." She set the page down and lifted the next sheet. "Second, the entry authorizes a transfer in the amount of $9,500 even. I have been through 4 years of this household's genuine disbursements, and there is not one round figure among them. Every real payment carries cents, taxes, fees, the arithmetic dust of actual life. Forgers write round numbers because round numbers are easier to invent than truth. Mr. Kessler at least understood the accounts he was robbing. This man does not even know what an honest page looks like." Eamon's eyes flickered, just once. But she saw it and pressed on. Third, the message log. She turned the printed sheet to face them. It shows documents sent from my terminal 3 nights ago at 11 minutes past midnight. I was not at that terminal 3 nights ago, but do not take my word for it. Take the boilers. Mrs. Pruitt will tell you the heat in the east wing knocks twice through the pipes before it shuts down for the night. And it shuts down on a timer, and the study radiator log, which your own maintenance man keeps, shows the system off well before midnight. Whoever sat at my terminal sat in a cold room in the dark, because turning on a lamp would have been visible from the drive. Now ask yourselves, what kind of employee knows how to move through this house at midnight without a light, knows which corridors the cameras cover, knows exactly the 11-minute gap when the east hallway camera cycles for its maintenance reset. She laid the last sheet on the desk and turned it to face Cormac, and her voice did not rise. It lowered, and the room leaned in to hear it. The man who forged this page has never kept a book a day in his life, she said, but he knows the security rotation by heart, because he wrote it. The silence that followed had a direction. Every head in that room turned, slowly, the way a compass needle turns, away from the accountant's desk in the corner and toward the window, toward the 2 men standing there, toward the uniforms they wore, and the department those uniforms answered to, and Margot watched Cormac Byrne arrive at the address her numbers had been walking him toward all along. She picked up her final sheet, the one she had built 2 nights ago, and never had the chance to deliver, and she placed it in his hands. "There is more," she said quietly. "I found it before this morning happened, and I believe this morning happened because I found it. Money has been flowing through 2 shell vendors, not out of the house, but back into it. A second hidden salary paid for years to someone inside these walls. Kessler was not the head of the snake, Mr. Byrne. Kessler was the little thief who stumbled onto the big one and ran for his life. I traced the account through the payroll ledgers you gave me last week. It settles, every month, into the hands of your chief of security, Silas Marsh." The name dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. 7 years, Eamon said, very softly, the first crack anyone had ever heard in that headstone voice. 7 years he has stood 3 steps from your shoulder. Cormac Byrne looked down at the page in his hands, and his face did not move at all, and that stillness was more frightening than any rage. And outside the tall windows the snow went on falling over Ravenhill, soft and white and indifferent, covering the tracks of a house that now knew it sheltered a traitor who did not yet know he had been found. Nothing happened that day, and that was the first lesson Margot learned about how Cormac Byrne went to war, because a lesser man would have dragged Silas Marsh into the study within the hour, and Cormac did not so much as glance toward the window where his chief of security stood at his usual post, 3 steps from his shoulder, keeping his usual watch. The 2 security men were quietly reassigned to the gatehouse on some ordinary pretext. Mrs. Pruitt appeared at Margot's door that evening, with the cup of warm milk restored to its silver tray, and an apology folded so deep inside her stiff goodnight that only a careful listener would have found it, and Margot found it, and said nothing, and drank the milk. The house exhaled, the house pretended, and late that night, when the corridors were empty, Eamon came to fetch her to the study, where the fire was low and the curtains were drawn against the dark, and Cormac stood waiting with 2 chairs pulled near the hearth. And for the first time since she had walked through his gate, he asked her to sit not as an employee, but as something he had never once, in 7 years, allowed Silas Marsh to be, which was a person he trusted alone in a room with his back turned. What he said then, he said plainly, watching the fire instead of her face, as if giving her privacy for her own decision. "Tomorrow I begin taking my house back," he said. "But before I do, you need to understand what you found, and what it cost to have found it. As of this morning, you are not a bookkeeper who works for me. A bookkeeper hands over a page and goes home. You cannot hand this over and go home, because the man on that page has friends we have not named yet, and they will learn soon enough whose pencil drew the map. If you stand in this room tomorrow, you are standing inside my world, and my world does not have a door that opens back out onto an ordinary life. So I am offering you the door tonight, once, while it still exists." He turned from the fire then and looked at her, and there was no coldness in it, only a terrible honest weight. "I can have you and the child in a warm house 2,000 miles from this city by the weekend," he said. "New name, clean paper, money enough that neither of you works a day for 3 lifetimes. No one would ever find you. I am very good at that. And no one would ever call it running. It would be the wisest thing you have ever done, and I would think no less of you. And that is the whole truth. The fire settled. Ozzy sighed in his sleep against the hearthstone, and Margot Ellison sat with her hands resting on the round of her belly and looked into the flames and took the offer seriously, because it deserved that, because it was the first time in her life a powerful person had handed her a genuine choice with no trap inside it. She thought about doors. The door of the firm closing behind her with her name ruined on the wrong side of it. The apartment door with the changed locks and her clothes still inside. The tall white door of the Whitmore house shutting on her and the grandchild they refused to name. Her whole life, doors had been closed on her, closed for her, closed about her. Always by other hands, always with someone else explaining afterward why it was for the best. And now here at last was a door held open, and she found that what she felt was not temptation, but a strange calm fury at 3 decades of hands that were not hers deciding what she could survive. She lifted her eyes from the fire and gave him her answer in the voice she used for final numbers. "All my life other people have made my choices for me," she said. "Where I lived, what I was worth, what I was allowed to keep. This time the choice is mine, and I am making it in my own name and my child's. I stay." Something passed across Cormac Byrne's face that no one at Ravenhill had seen in 10 years, gone before it could be named. And he nodded once, the nod of a man sealing a partnership rather than granting a favor, and then he pulled his chair closer, and the last of the distance between employer and employee burned away in the low firelight as they bent together over the plan. Silas Marsh sold information. She had proven it, schedules and routes, and the private movements of the man he guarded. So they would not cut off the flow. They would poison the well. They would let him keep his post, and his salary, and his treachery. And beginning tomorrow, every schedule that reached his hands would be a lie built for a purpose. A trail of breadcrumbs laid by the two of them at this fire, leading whoever was buying Ravenhill's secrets into a corridor with no exits. The trap was set that night by a bookkeeper and a devil, patient as winter. The only question left was who would walk into it first. The cold came down off the lake that week like a verdict, the hardest freeze of the winter, and it found the one enemy in Ravenhill that Cormac Byrne could not outmaneuver, the old metal the surgeons had never been able to take out of his left leg. Margot learned about it the way the whole house learned about everything, through silence. He was ashen at breakfast and gone by noon, the study doors shut, and when Eamon carried in the afternoon coffee, there came the crack of a glass striking the hearthstone, and a voice like gravel dragged over iron, telling everyone to get out, and Eamon withdrew with the tray still full, and Mrs. Pruitt herded the maids to the far wing, and the whole great house held its breath around one locked room, the way a body holds itself around a wound. They were all afraid of him. That was the plain truth. And it was also, Margot understood as she stood in the kitchen wrapping dry rice into a flannel cloth, and warming it in the oven the way her mother had taught her 30 years ago in a drafty apartment, where they could not afford a heating pad, entirely useless to him. Fear had never once healed anybody. She carried the warm bundle down the corridor, and she did not knock, because a knock asks permission, and permission was the one thing his pride could not grant. And she pushed open the study door and walked into the lion's den with her chin level and her heart hammering exactly as hard as it had the first night. And he came up out of the chair by the fire with his face gray and furious and half wild with pain, and told her to get out. She did not get out. She crossed the room, lowered herself carefully down beside his chair with one hand braced on the armrest, and pressed the warm flannel bundle firmly against the outside of his knee. And when he stiffened, she said, in the driest voice she owned, "I am treating you like a ledger line that will not balance. Sit still while I reconcile you." For a moment the whole room hung on a hinge. Then the heat began to work its old, humble magic into the seized muscle, and the fight went out of him by inches, and he sank back into the chair like a tide going out, and his head tipped against the leather, and his eyes closed, and for a long while there was nothing but the fire and the wind at the windows and her hand holding the warmth in place. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and stripped of all its armor, and he told her, the only time he would ever tell anyone, the story the whole city thought it knew. His father had run the docks in the old way, he said, hard but fair, a man who laughed easily and trusted deeply, and the man he trusted most, the man who sat at their table on Sundays and stood godfather at a christening, had sold him to his enemies for a warehouse contract. They came on a night ferry. His father had pushed him down behind a stack of pallets, and the shot that was meant for Cormac's heart had cut along his collarbone and up his neck instead. And the shot that followed it took his father, And he had lain there 19 years old, with his father's hand going slack in his, and learned in one instant everything he would ever believe about trust. 10 years since I have slept a night through, he said to the fire. Every knock on a door, I count the exits. Every man who smiles, I ask what he is selling. It is no way to live, but it is how you stay alive, and I no longer remember which of those I chose. Margot did not say she was sorry. Sorry was a coin worn smooth by strangers. Instead, she spoke into the firelight about her own father, a tax preparer with chalk dust on his sleeves who had died the spring she turned 19, who used to check her homework with a red pencil and leave the last problem unmarked with a note that said, "You find it. You are better than me," and who was the last human being who had ever pulled out a chair for her without wanting something back, until a man in this house had ordered her a cup of warm milk in the middle of a blizzard. The word settled over them both, and neither moved to disturb them. And it was then, into that stillness, that the child kicked, hard and unmistakable, a small emphatic drumbeat against her side, and Margot laughed before she could stop herself, a shaky, unguarded sound she had not heard from her own throat in a year. And acting on an instinct older than caution, she reached over, took the scarred right hand of the most feared man in Chicago, and laid it flat against the curve where the kick had landed. The child kicked again, straight into his palm. Cormac Byrne went absolutely still. Still the way glass is still. A man holding his breath in the presence of something he was terrified of breaking, and the winter in his eyes cracked through to whatever ran beneath it. And he said, hoarse and quiet, "Strong little thing." "Has to be," Margot said. "Takes after its mother." He did not move his hand for a long time, and when at last he spoke again to bid her good night at the study door, he did not call her Miss Ellison. He said her name, Margot, plain and careful, like a man setting something valuable on a high shelf, and she carried the sound of it up the stairs. And while the house slept, out in the gatehouse where the night shift kept its watch, Silas Marsh opened the folder containing next week's schedules, freshly issued, and began, once again, to read. The days that followed asked too much of her, and she gave it anyway, because that was the only arithmetic Margot Ellison had ever trusted. And between the false schedules that had to be built line by convincing line, and the true ledgers that still had to balance, and the secret she now carried alongside the child, she began staying at her desk long after the house went dark, and her body, which had been keeping quiet accounts of its own, finally called in the debt. It happened near midnight. She stood up from the desk too quickly to fetch a file, and the study tilted sideways, and the lamplight drained out of the edges of the world, and the last thing she registered was the sound of her own name, in a voice she had never heard frightened before. Cormac Byrne had not been asleep. He came through the doorway before she reached the floor, and he caught her. And what happened after that the household would speak of in low voices for years, because the man who had not been seen in a public building in a decade, the man whose face never crossed a lobby camera, the man whose whole survival was built on never being where anyone could predict, did not call a driver, and did not call a doctor to the house, and did not weigh a single one of his iron rules. He wrapped her in his own coat, lifted her, and carried her out the front doors into the falling snow, across the white courtyard to the garage, and he drove the road into the city himself, with one hand on the wheel and one eye on the pale, unconscious face against the seat beside him. And he walked into the bright fluorescent noise of St. Bridget Hospital carrying a pregnant woman in his arms, with ink still staining his rolled-up sleeve. And the night staff of the maternity floor looked up into the face that ran the Chicago docks and forgot how to breathe. They took her from him on a gurney, and a young doctor with a clipboard planted herself in his path with the fearless efficiency of the truly exhausted and asked him the intake question, "Sir, what is your relationship to the patient?" And for the space of 2 heartbeats, the most feared man in the city stood in a hospital corridor with snow melting in his dark hair and no answer in his mouth, because every true answer was a word he had no right to yet. And then he said, quietly, in a voice that ended the interview, "I am the one who signs every bill this building sends. Save them both first. Ask me questions after." And they saved them both, though as the night unwound it became clear there was mercifully little saving to be done. The doctor emerging near dawn to explain in plain, kind words that mother and child were fine, that the mother was severely exhausted and badly run down, and had scared everyone properly, that what she needed was rest and food, and to be forbidden, in the doctor's exact phrase, from working herself into the ground for 2. And through all of it, Cormac Byrne stood nodding like a schoolboy taking instruction. This man whom mayors flattered and rivals feared, memorizing every word. They let him sit with her. She surfaced once in the small hours, swimming up through the warm gray, and found the room dim, and the machines murmuring their soft assurances, and a large familiar shape in the too small chair beside the bed, jacket gone, sleeves still inked, wide awake, and she was too far under to speak. But she felt his hand close carefully around hers on the blanket, and she slept again, truly slept. And the man who had not slept a night through in 10 years kept his eyes open until morning, one more time. And for the first time in 10 years, he did it not because he feared what might come through the door, but to guard what was already in the room. She came home to Ravenhill 2 days later under strict orders, hers from the doctor, everyone else's apparently from somewhere higher, because the house she returned to had quietly rearranged itself around her existence. The boilers had been rescheduled, so that warmth now followed her hours, rising early in the east wing and lingering late in the study, and her desk had been moved from its drafty corner to the place nearest the fire, and not one person in the house said a single word about any of it. Mrs. Pruitt enforced the doctor's rest orders with the gentle mercilessness of a prison warden, and Ozzy abandoned all pretense and simply lay across her feet like a furnace with opinions, and the ledgers were rationed to her in thin folders, as though pages were medicine. And so she rested, and the house breathed around her. And it would have been almost peace, except that peace was not what any of them had built that week. And she knew it, and Cormac knew it, and out in the gatehouse Silas Marsh knew nothing at all, which was exactly the point, because the newest false schedule had already been issued, the one with the carefully planted appointment in the city, and tomorrow night the breadcrumbs would finally be tested, and somewhere beyond the gates, in the dark they had baited themselves, something was going to bite. The appointment on the false schedule was a real one. That was the cold genius of it. A routine prenatal checkup at a discreet clinic on the north side, entered into the house calendar in the ordinary way, and left where Silas Marsh could not fail to find it. And when Margot asked why they would use her doctor's visit as the bait, Cormac gave her the answer of a man who had been hunted before, because a lie works best when it is wrapped around the truth, and because the road home from that clinic runs along the lake, and there is a stretch of it with no houses and no cameras and only one way through, and if I were buying my enemy's movements, that is the mile I would spend them on. So they went, and the checkup was unremarkable and the child was declared thriving. And it was full dark when the car turned onto the lake road for home, the big armored sedan that Eamon had prepared, with Cormac himself at the wheel, and Margot beside him, and the frozen lake running silver and black beyond the guardrail, and the snow coming down in slow fat flakes through the headlights. And she was watching those flakes, and half listening to the quiet engine, when Cormac said, in a voice so level, it took her a moment to understand it was a warning, "There is a car on the access road ahead, with its engine running and its lights off. Do exactly what I say and nothing else." She saw it then, a long black shape sitting in the mouth of the side road, like something that had grown there, and as their headlights swept toward it, the shape moved, surging out across both lanes and swinging broadside to block the road, and Cormac brought the sedan down from speed with a smoothness that felt impossible. No squeal, no skid, just weight and control, stopping them 40 yards short with the engine idling, and Margot's heart climbed into her throat as figures came out of the black car into the snow. 2 of them, 3, moving with the deliberateness of men who believed they had all the time in the world. "Doors locked," Cormac said quietly. "Glass will hold. They know none of that." And then he did the thing she would remember for the rest of her life. He reached across the seat, unhurried, as if there were no men in the road at all, and he drew her toward him and turned his own body sideways between her and the windshield, one arm folding her head against his chest, his shoulders making a wall of himself around her and the child. And when she began to shake, he spoke into her hair in a voice with no fear in it anywhere, a voice like a hand steadying a scale. "Close your eyes. Listen to my heart. As long as you can hear it beating, nothing on this earth touches you or this child." And she closed her eyes, and she listened, and it was beating, slow and even and unhurried, the calmest heart in the state of Illinois. And years later she would tell her daughter that this was the moment, not the milk and not the hospital, this, a man making his own heartbeat into a shelter on a frozen road. What happened outside the car she experienced only as sound and light through her closed lids, the crunch of boots in snow coming closer and then stopping, a sudden white blaze as the whole road lit up from 3 directions at once, Floodlights off the utility truck that had been parked with its hood raised half a mile back, and off the plow that had been idling at the boat launch since late afternoon, and a voice through a loudspeaker that she recognized as Eamon Doyle's, calm as a Sunday usher, instructing the men in the road that they were surrounded, that the things in their hands should meet the pavement now, and that nobody needed to make this evening any longer than it had already been. There was a clatter, then another. There were no shots. There was only the sound, absurd and enormous in the silence, of the lake ice settling somewhere out in the dark with a long, low boom like a door closing under the world, and then boots, and voices, and the efficient sounds of men being folded into vehicles. And through all of it, Cormac Byrne never moved, never loosened the wall of his shoulders, never let the cold reach her, until Eamon's voice came again, not through the loudspeaker now, but through the radio on the console. Dry as dust, road is clear, all three collected, not a scratch on anyone, including them. And Cormac finally eased back into his seat and put the car in gear, and Margot opened her eyes to the falling snow and the taillights ahead, and her own two hands pressed over the small, determined heartbeat inside her. They drove in silence for a mile before the radio crackled once more, and this time there was something new in Eamon's voice, something almost like appetite, and the words he said sent a current down Margot's spine and lit a cold light in Cormac's eyes at the same time, because they were the words the whole trap had been built to earn. "One of them is asking for you by name," Eamon said. "He says he knows who is paying, and he wants to talk." Cormac saw Margot safely into the warm hall of Ravenhill, waited until Mrs. Pruitt had taken charge of her with tea and blankets and the full authority of her office, and then he went back out into the night. And what happened in the hours that followed was told to Margot afterward only in pieces. But the pieces were enough, because they showed her exactly what kind of man she had chosen to stand beside, and it was not the kind the city's whispers described. The men from the road were being held in the old stone boathouse down by the water, dry and lit and guarded, and the one who had asked to talk was sitting on a bench with his wrists secured, a heavy-set man with a boxer's flattened face, and he looked up, expecting to negotiate with rage, because rage was the currency of the world he worked in, and instead, Cormac Byrne pulled a wooden crate across the floor and sat down on it directly in front of him, unhurried, at eye level, the way a man sits down to go over paperwork, and that wrongness, that terrible calm, drained the room of temperature faster than any shouting could have. "You wanted to talk," Cormac said. "We will talk, but first you should understand your arithmetic. The car you stopped tonight was carrying a woman who is expecting a child." He let that sit. The man's eyes flickered. "I want you to pray," Cormac continued, in the same level voice a banker uses to explain compound interest, "that she sleeps well tonight, and tomorrow night, and every night after, because I promise you this, and I have never once broken a promise in this city. Exactly how comfortable the rest of your life turns out to be depends entirely on the quality of that woman's sleep." Then he stood, and that was all. No blow, no threat that any court could write down, and he nodded to Eamon. And Eamon stepped forward with a folder that had been prepared for weeks, because the trap had never been only about catching men on a road. It had been about catching them with paper, and the folder held all of it. The schedule leaks matched to dates, the payments traced through the shell vendors, the plates and phones and prior warrants of the men on the bench, a gift-wrapped case, and before dawn, the three of them were delivered, with the folder, into the hands of a federal prosecutor whose office had been trying to make a case on the Lake Road cruise for 6 years. And that was the whole of their punishment, and the whole of his mercy, the full weight of the law, and not 1 ounce of anything else. Silas Marsh was last. They brought him to the boathouse as the sky was turning gray, and he came in wearing his uniform, 7 years of trust stitched into the shoulders of it, and he had prepared himself, anyone could see it, for fury, for grief, for the explosion any betrayed man owes his betrayer, and Cormac gave him none of it, and the absence was worse than any storm. He stood by the window with his back half turned and informed Silas Marsh of his future in the tone of a man reading items off an inventory. The apartment held in the company's name, gone as of this morning. The pension account, frozen and forfeited under the terms he had signed, and clearly never read. The car, the credit, the licenses, all of it corporate property, all of it already collected, and the file of his 7 years of sales, the schedules, the routes, the accounts Margot had unearthed, line by line. That file was not going into any fire. It was already on the same prosecutor's desk as the men from the road, with his name typed neatly on the cover. Silas began to speak, and Cormac turned from the window, and whatever was in his face stopped the words in the traitor's throat. "My father died because of a man like you," Cormac said quietly. "For 10 years I told myself that if I ever found the next one, I would make him disappear." He shook his head slowly. "But disappearing is a gift. You are going to live a long time, in a very small room. And every single morning you are going to wake up remembering that you once had everything, and that you sold it for a second salary you never even got to spend." It was over then, or it should have been. But as Eamon's men took his arms, Silas Marsh did the last treacherous thing left in his power. He tried to buy his way into a smaller room with a bigger name, and the name came out of him in a rush. "Wait, you want the man who paid me? I will give you him. I dealt with lawyers and cutouts, but I saw the account once. I saw where it clears. It clears through Voss. It is Harlan Voss," and the boathouse went silent. Eamon's head came around. The men at the door went still, and Cormac Byrne, who had not been surprised by anything in a decade, stood frozen in the gray light of the window with the lake behind him. Because of all the names in the city of Chicago, the traitor had just spoken, the one that reached backward through 10 years of sleepless nights, all the way down to a dock, a ferry, and his father's hand going slack in his. He came back to the house with the gray morning behind him and found her already at her desk by the fire, because of course she was. And he stood in the study doorway for a moment before he said, "I need your eyes." And something in the way he said it made her set down her pencil at once. He laid a name on the desk between them, the way a man lays down a card he has been holding all night. "Harlan Voss." She frowned. "The Voss Group," she said slowly. "Private capital. I audited adjacent accounts once in my old life. He keeps his name off buildings and his face out of papers. The cleanest money on the lakefront. They call him a philanthropist." Cormac's voice was very quiet. "They called the man who sold my father a friend of the family, too," he said. "Silas's second salary clears through an account that settles into the Voss Group. My people confirmed it an hour ago." Margot went still, and then her mind did what her mind always did. It started walking the ledger, and he watched her do it. "Wait," she said. "Wait. If Voss is buying your schedules, this was never street business. A man like that does not spend money to frighten you. He spends money to acquire things. What does he acquire if something happens to you on a lake road?" "The docks," Cormac said. "The trucking, the warehouses, the whole spine of the harbor, thrown into chaos, bought at auction through 6 friendly shells before my body was cold." She stood up without realizing she had. One hand braced on the desk. "Then let me show you my side of the board," she said, "because I have been staring at a page all week that would not balance, and you just balanced it. The Whitmore estate. You hold their debt through your lending front, but I went back through the filings when I built the case against Lyle's release papers, and yours is the junior debt. Somebody else holds the mortgages underneath, bundled through a trust in Delaware, and I could not find the beneficiary." Cormac had gone very still. "Say that again," he said. "Somebody bought the Whitmore family's foundations out from under them," she said, quietly now, "more than a year ago. Somebody has been squeezing Patrice dry in the dark, calling the loans in pieces, keeping her desperate. I thought it was a bank being a bank." His voice came out flat. "It clears through Voss. It was not a question." She pulled a folder from her drawer, the probate search his own investigator had delivered 2 days ago, and opened it on the desk. "Then look at this, and tell me what a desperate woman does when the man squeezing her also knows what is in her dead son's will," she said. "Wesley filed a new will 4 months before the crash. It is real, it is signed, it is sitting in a courthouse queue for a hearing that is days away. He left 40% of his Whitmore holdings to his child. And the Whitmore holdings, Mr. Byrne, are not silk dresses and charity galas. I pulled the asset schedule. The estate's last unmortgaged value is land. Industrial parcels. 3 of them." She turned the survey map to face him and watched his face change as he read it. Watched the winter in his eyes crack, because the 3 parcels ran in an unbroken line along the north edge of the harbor, bordering his docks on 3 sides. "The last piece," he said, almost to himself. "He has been buying the noose for years, and my docks are the neck, and those parcels close the knot, and the only thing standing between him and them is—" He stopped. Margot finished it for him, and her hand moved without her permission to rest over the child. "Is a will that gives them to a baby who has not been born yet," she said. "A lottery ticket. That is what Lyle called it. I thought he meant the inheritance. He did not mean the inheritance. He meant the land. And if that phrase was in his mouth, then it was put there by whoever pays him. And I do not think that is Patrice. I do not think it was ever Patrice. The silence stretched between them while the fire ticked, and when Cormac spoke again, there was something new in his voice, a kind of appalled admiration for the shape of the thing. Then the joke was never hers, he said. Think of it. Voss holds her debts. Voss owns her lawyer. Voss needs the scandal. The pregnant woman thrown out of the devil's house. My name dragged through every paper in the state. Cameras on my gates for a year, so that when the will surfaces, no judge alive gives custody of 40% of that land to a child under my roof. She sent you here to be ruined, but he wrote the errand. And Margot sat down slowly, because her knees had opinions, and she started to laugh, very softly, at the sheer blind poetry of it. Then he made one mistake, she said. What? He looked at her. His pawn crossed the board, she said. The scandal was supposed to destroy a helpless woman. Instead, it delivered the one accountant in Chicago who could read his handwriting straight into the house of the one man in Chicago, with reason to burn him down. Cormac Byrne looked at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since she had known him, he smiled all the way, and it was not a warm expression, it was the smile his enemies never got to describe afterward. Days, he said. The hearing is in days, and Patrice is out of money, out of time, and out of choices. Desperate people knock on doors, Margot said. Then we should decide, said the devil of the Chicago docks, what she finds when this one opens. They did not have to wait long, because 2 mornings later, the gate intercom announced a visitor who had not been invited and would not be turned away, and Patrice Whitmore swept into the great hall of Ravenhill in a coat of ivory silk and Russian fur, powdered and armored and magnificent, with her daughter Kendall trailing 3 steps behind her like a pale, frightened echo, and Margot, watching from beside the study fire, understood that she was about to see the final performance of a lifelong actress who had run out of theaters. It began exactly as they had predicted it would. Patrice pressed a gloved hand to her heart and became, before their eyes, a grieving grandmother, her voice trembling on cue as she spoke of sleepless nights, of a family torn apart, of her poor son's memory, and when that drew nothing from the 2 still figures by the fire, she changed costumes without missing a beat and became the outraged matriarch, declaring that Margot was being held in this house under coercion, that people were asking questions, that she had journalists, dear friends, ready to print the whole sordid story of the devil of the docks and the vulnerable woman trapped behind his gates. And when that too fell into silence, when Cormac Byrne simply looked at her the way a man looks at weather, the costumes came off at last, and what stood in the hall was the truth of her, and the truth of her named its price. $1 million, Patrice said, and her voice was suddenly neither grieving nor outraged, only hungry. Wired discreetly. In exchange, I withdraw every petition. I sign whatever your lawyers like, and I remove myself permanently from the life of that woman and her child. Refuse me, and I go to the papers anyway, and I promise you the story they print will not be about you, Mr. Byrne. It will be about her, the scheming little accountant who could not even give her child respectable paperwork, and we shall see how the courts feel about custody then. Margot came up out of her chair with a year of swallowed words rising in her throat, but she never got to spend them, because Cormac moved first. And he did not raise his voice, and he did not answer the threat at all. He walked to the long marble table in the center of the hall, and laid 3 things upon it, one after another, with the unhurried precision of a dealer turning cards. The first was a bound stack of documents, thick as a Bible. These are the debts of the Whitmore estate, he said. All of them. The banks sold their notes. The private lenders sold theirs. $12 million of your paper, bought quietly over these past weeks, and every dollar of it now answers to me. You came here to sell me your absence, Lady Whitmore. You cannot sell what I already own. The woman under the powder had gone very pale, but he was already laying down the second thing, a slim folder, and he opened it so she could see the notarized copy inside, and Margot watched Patrice Whitmore's face come apart by degrees, because it was Wesley's will, the real one, the one with the courthouse stamp, the one that a records clerk had certified from the original filing after Cormac's investigator walked the probate queue, and its twin, as everyone in that hall now understood, had been sitting for half a year in a private safe in a cream-colored breakfast room, hidden from the courts by the grandmother of the heir it named. Concealing a testamentary instrument, Cormac said mildly, is a crime in this state. My lawyers tell me judges take it personally. And then he laid down the third thing, and it was a pen. The hall was so quiet Margot could hear the snow ticking against the high windows. You have two choices, Cormac Byrne said, in the voice of a man closing a ledger. You sign a full release of every claim against Margot Ellison and her child. You withdraw from the hearing, and you leave this city. Or you refuse. And tomorrow morning, the federal prosecutor, who is already reviewing certain other matters connected to your family, receives one more file, and you can explain to a courtroom why your dead son's will spent half a year in your safe, while his child's mother counted out her last $47. The pen lay on the marble between them, small and black and absolute. Patrice Whitmore stared at it, and her jaw worked, and for one long moment, the whole proud architecture of her life swayed visibly on its rotten foundations. And then, because women like Patrice never fall alone if there is anyone left to pull down with them, she turned, ivory silk whispering, and fixed her eyes on the pale girl by the door, who had not spoken a word since entering the house. "Kendall," she said, and her voice was iron wrapped in honey. "Come here, darling. You are going to tell these people what we discussed. You are going to tell them what kind of woman your brother truly thought she was." Kendall Whitmore had spent 24 years learning to make herself small, and every person in that hall watched her begin the old familiar shrinking, the dropped eyes, the half-step forward at her mother's command, the obedient folding of a girl who had been raised as an accessory, and Margot felt her own heart sink, because she knew better than anyone in the world what it cost to stand up inside that family, and she did not believe the girl had it in her. And then Kendall Whitmore stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the great stone hall, halfway between her mother and the fire, and something moved through her thin frame like wind through a door left open, and she lifted her eyes, and she took one step backward. "No, Mother," she said. The word fell into the hall like the first crack in river ice. Patrice's smile did not falter. She simply repeated the summons, sweeter and colder, the voice that had governed that household for 3 decades. But Kendall shook her head slowly, and when she spoke again, her voice shook and did not stop. "No, I am not going to say it. Wesley loved her. He told me so the summer before the crash. He told me she was the only person who never once asked him for anything. And I sat at your table and watched you tell the whole city she was a thief, and I said nothing." She looked at the folder lying open on the marble, and her face crumpled and rebuilt itself. "I read the will. Mother, I found it in your safe half a year ago, when you sent me for your pearls. I read every line, and I put it back, and I have been a coward every single day since." She turned to Margot then, and her eyes were streaming, and she was not small anymore. "I am sorry," she said simply. "I have been cowardly enough for one lifetime." The silence that followed was absolute, and in it, Patrice Whitmore aged 10 years standing up. Because the devil of the docks had only taken her money and her leverage, and those she knew how to lose, she had lost them before. But her own child, standing in a stranger's hall and refusing her in front of witnesses, that was a country she had never once imagined losing, and the collapse of it happened behind her eyes in complete silence, an empire of will falling with no sound at all. She looked at the pen. She picked it up with a hand that had signed away nothing in its life, and signed away everything now, one line after another, where Cormac's lawyer had placed the tabs, the release, the withdrawal, the permanent departure, her signature growing smaller with each page, like a voice fading down a corridor. And when it was finished, she set the pen down with exaggerated care, gathered her ivory silk around her like the last of her dignity, and walked out of Ravenhill without a word. And Kendall followed her as far as the great doors and then paused, and looked back at Margot for one long second, a look with something unfinished folded inside it, and then the doors closed on them both. What remained was done quietly, and by the book, the file that had grown fat in the study safe, Margot's tracing of the shell vendors, the payment paths that settled into the Voss Group, Silas Marsh's recorded statement naming his paymaster, the survey map of 3 parcels shaped like a noose around the harbor. All of it went by courier into the hands of the federal prosecutor, who had spent 6 years hunting the Lake Road crews, and had just been handed the man above the men, above them, and there was no thunder in it, no headlines that week, just paper moving through the machinery of the law, subpoenas being drafted in quiet offices, a clean, cold net beginning to close around the most respectable man on the lakefront. And when Eamon asked him, once, in the study, whether the law was truly all he intended, Cormac Byrne stood at the window for a moment before he answered. My father was a lawful man, he said. It is his debt. It gets paid in his currency. And that night, something happened at Ravenhill that no one witnessed, but that changed the house forever. Something Margot only learned when Mrs. Pruitt mentioned it in passing days later with wet eyes and a scolding tone, as if the miracle were an inconvenience. The man who had not slept a night through in 10 years went up the stairs before midnight, and slept, deeply and without waking, until the sun was full over the lake, and the house exhaled around him. And the days that followed were the gentlest anyone there could remember. And they might have gone on that way, quiet and healing, except that toward the end of the week the gate intercom sounded again, and this time the voice was young and uncertain, and when Margot came down to the hall, she found Kendall Whitmore standing just inside the doors with snow in her hair, alone, holding a small wooden box against her chest with both hands, the way a person holds something that is either very fragile or very heavy, or both. They sat in the study because it was the warmest room, Kendall perched on the edge of the chair by the fire with melting snow still bright in her hair, and for a while she could not begin. She only held the box, and Margot did not hurry her, and Cormac stood back near the window, present and silent. And at last Kendall set the small wooden box on the low table between them and pushed it across with both hands, the way a child returns something stolen. It was in the safe, she said, behind the will. Mother never opened it. I think she could not bear to. It is Wesley's. The things from his desk, the things the estate lawyers packed, and she took before anyone made a list. It belongs to you. It always belonged to you, and I should have carried it here half a year ago. Margot lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay the ordinary treasure of an interrupted life. A fountain pen with a chewed cap, a wristwatch stopped at some meaningless afternoon, a folded ticket stub from a baseball game at Wrigley Field, a photograph of a spring day she remembered being happy inside. And beneath all of it, at the bottom, an envelope of plain cream paper, unsealed, with 3 words on its face in a slanting, hurried, familiar hand. For the baby. Her fingers went cold around it. She looked up once, at Kendall, who nodded, and at Cormac, who did not move. And then she took out the single sheet inside and unfolded it, and Wesley Whitmore spoke to his child from the far side of everything, in the plain, unliterary voice of a man who did not know he was writing his last page. Hello, little one, it began. Your mother does not know I am writing this. I am at the airfield, and the fog is late lifting, and I had a strange feeling on the drive out here, so I am putting this in my desk for you, and someday when you are old enough I will show it to you, and we will laugh at how serious your old man was. I do not know yet if you are a boy or a girl. I find I do not care at all. Here is what I do know. Your mother is the bravest person I have ever met. She thinks she is only careful, only exact, but I have watched her stand up in rooms full of people who wanted her to fail, over and over, and never once bend. I have money, and I never earned $1 of it. She has nothing, and earned every inch of her life. If you take after her, you will be fine. If you take after me, listen to her. And if it should ever happen that I am not there to walk you to school and embarrass you at your games, then I am asking you, from right here at this fogged-in airfield, let your mother teach you what brave means. She is the best teacher of it alive. Love, your father, who cannot wait to meet you. The paper made a small sound in the silence, and Margot Ellison, who had not wept when they took her career, or her home, or her name, who had stood dry-eyed in front of accusers and lawyers and the devil of the docks himself, broke at last, all at once, the way a dam breaks, from the bottom, and she folded forward over the letter and wept without any grace or control. The crying of a woman paying off a full year of unshed tears with interest, and Kendall covered her own mouth and cried with her, and the fire burned, and Ozzy pressed his great head against Margot's knee, and through all of it Cormac Byrne did not offer a handkerchief or a single soothing word, because he understood, as few men ever learn to, that some grief must not be interrupted. Only when the storm had passed through her, when she sat back exhausted and hollowed and holding the letter against the curve of her child, did he cross the room and lower himself into the chair beside her, and what he said then he said carefully, like a man laying stones for something meant to stand a long time. She is going to grow up knowing exactly who her father was, he said, what he wrote on that page, what he thought of her mother. I will see to it that not one word of him is ever lost or diminished in any house of mine. He paused, and his voice came lower. I am not here to replace him, Margot. I would not insult either of you by trying. I am only asking to stand guard over the part of the road he did not get to walk." She could not answer him in words, so she reached across the space between the chairs and gripped his scarred hand, hard. And he held on, and that was the whole conversation, and it was enough. The hearing came and went that same week, quiet as falling snow. The true will admitted without challenge now that its twin had surfaced, and its concealer had fled the state. The judge ruling in a dry, procedural voice that 40% of the Whitmore holdings would pass into a protected trust for the child of Wesley Whitmore, untouchable by any creditor or claimant until she came of age. And Margot sat in the courtroom with Wesley's letter in her coat pocket and listened to the law, for the first time in her life, keep a promise to her. It should have been the end of the story, and she believed it was, and she was wrong. Because on the drive home, Cormac Byrne kept glancing at her in a way she had never seen from him, the look of a man rehearsing something in his head and getting it wrong on purpose. And when she finally asked him what was on his mind, he was quiet for a full mile of snowy road before he answered. "There is one thing left," he said, "that I have not told you." He would not say it in the car, and he would not say it over the quiet dinner Mrs. Pruitt laid for them. And it was not until they were back in the study, with the fire built high and the snow coming down soft over the dark lake, that Margot lost her patience with waiting and cross-examined him the way she cross-examined a crooked page, directly, and about money. Because money was where men hid their truths. $12 million, she said. "You bought $12 million of Whitmore paper. I have been doing that arithmetic for 2 days, and it will not balance. You did not need their debt to protect the docks. The will did that. You did not need it to break Patrice. The concealment charge did that. You spent a fortune buying the obligations of a family you despise, before you knew about Voss, before any of it was strategy. I have checked the dates. Cormac. The first purchases cleared the week after Lyle Prescott stood in that hall. So the question stands. Why?" He was quiet for a while, looking into the fire, and when he answered he did not dress it up, because he had never learned how, and she would not have believed it dressed. "Because of how she looked at you," he said. "That morning she sent you here. You told me about it in this room and your voice never changed, and that was the worst part, that you had learned to say it calmly. She looked at you like a flawed piece of merchandise she was returning, like something to be marked down and moved out." He turned from the fire then, and his eyes, when they found her, had nothing of the lake left in them. They were only warm, and only tired, and only certain. "I bought her debts because I wanted every dollar of power that woman thinks she has to run through my hands first, and I am done pretending it was business. It was for you. I have been tired for a long time, Margot. Tired of a world so blind it could hold you in its hands and see nothing worth keeping. And I found I had $12 million worth of arguments with that world, so I made them." The fire ticked. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock let the hour go by without counting it aloud. "And what am I then?" she asked, and her voice came out lower than she intended. "In your ledger, Mr. Byrne, what line do I sit on?" "You are the only quiet I have found in 10 years, he said. He said it plainly, like a balance carried forward. "Every person who has ever come through my gates wanted something from what I am. My money, my protection, my fear. You walked in half frozen with $47 and a child. And inside a month, you were the one bringing me a bag of warm rice for an old wound because you refused to let pity into the room. No one in my life has ever done that. No one has ever once treated my pain like a problem to be solved instead of a weakness to be managed." His voice roughened then, dropped, went somewhere he had never let it go in front of another living soul. "And the child?" he said. "Your child." He had to stop. He looked down at his own scarred hands. "That kick against my palm is the first time in 10 years I have wanted this house to be loud." He rose then, crossed to the desk, and took 2 things from the locked drawer, and he did not kneel when he came back. His leg had opinions, and neither of them had any use for theater. He simply set both things down on the low table in front of her, side by side, with the same deliberate care he had once used to lay 3 items on a marble slab, except that his hands were not steady now, and she saw it, and said nothing. The first was a small, worn ring box, and inside it a ring of old rose gold with a modest stone. Beautiful the way the watch on his wrist was beautiful, by surviving. "My mother's," he said. "She wore it through worse winters than this one." The second was a folder, and when Margot opened it, her breath left her, because it was a petition for adoption. Complete, prepared, signed by him everywhere, the law required, waiting only for her, and the name typed in the space for the child read simply, Baby Girl Ellison, to be amended upon birth, and the surname to be conferred was Byrne. She will keep every word of her father, Cormac said quietly. The letter, the trust, the name Whitmore in her history, where it belongs. But she will walk through this world, carrying a name that no one in this city will ever dare to make small. Both of you will. If you want it. He stood there, the most feared man in Chicago, with his heart laid out on a low table in two small objects, and made her his last offer in the language they had both spoken since the beginning. This is the final deal I will ever put in front of you, he said. There are no conditions and no clauses. You do not have to answer me with love. You do not have to answer me with anything. Just stay. That is the whole contract, Margot. Stay. And Margot Ellison, who trusted signatures more than speeches, picked up the pen from the table, opened the folder to its last page, and signed her name in the space beside his, in her careful upright hand with the crossed sevens, and then she looked up at him through the firelight, took his scarred face in both her ink-stained hands, and answered the rest of it without one single word. They were married on the last Saturday of winter, in the glass conservatory at the south end of Ravenhill, with snow banked white against the panes, and the lake beyond it frozen out to the horizon, and it was the smallest wedding Chicago society never heard about, which was exactly how the two of them wanted it. There was no cathedral and no columnist, only the people who had earned their places in that room. Eamon Doyle standing as witness in his best black coat, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief ironed flat as a playing card, and pretending afterward that the cold had gotten into them. Mrs. Pruitt holding the bride's gloves with the fierce ceremony of a woman guarding crown jewels. Kendall Whitmore standing on the bride's side of the aisle. The whole of the bride's family in one thin, brave young woman. And Ozzy sitting at the groom's boot with a green bow tied to his collar, deeply offended by it and enduring it like a soldier. Margot did not wear white. She wore a gown of deep forest green velvet, cut and fitted perfectly to a woman 8 months along, and she never had to ask how such a thing came to be hanging in her wardrobe on the morning of her wedding, because the dressmaker's card was tucked in the sleeve with the order date on it, placed weeks earlier, and the measurements on file were accurate to the half-inch, and the only person at Ravenhill who knew those measurements was Mrs. Pruitt, and the only person Mrs. Pruitt reported to had scarred hands and a scarred neck and a memory that missed nothing. When the vows were done, he kissed her carefully and completely, with his hands framing her face, and Eamon's handkerchief came out again, and that was the whole ceremony, and it was enough, and it was everything. Spring came late that year, the way it always does to Chicago, and when it finally broke over the lake, it brought the thaw and the green. And on a bright, loud morning in the first true week of it, in a sun-filled room at St. Bridget Hospital, Rosie Byrne came into the world exactly the way her mother had predicted she would, strong, furious about the delay, and announcing herself to the entire floor with a cry so healthy that the nurses laughed out loud. And the most feared man in the city stood beside the bed holding his daughter for the first time, with the terrified reverence of a man handed something holier than he believed he deserved. And Margot watched his face as it happened, and saw the last of the winter leave it for good. The story ends where it began, in the stone study at Ravenhill, on an evening in late spring with the windows open to the sound of the lake. The devil of the Chicago dock sat on the floor with his back against the great oak desk, his suit jacket abandoned, his sleeping daughter rising and falling on his chest, one of her tiny hands curled tight around his scarred finger, while Ozzy lay stretched along the rug beside them both, one eye open, on duty. Margot stood in the doorway watching them, and in her hands she held a cup of warm milk, and she thought about a night of snow, and an envelope sealed in crimson wax, about a script written to bury her, about $47 and a locked gate, and a joke that was supposed to end with the whole city laughing. Family, she had learned, is not the people whose blood you carry. Family is whoever remembers to warm the milk when the rest of the world has pushed you out into the snow. And as Rosie sighed in her sleep and gripped her father's finger tighter, Margot Ellison Byrne decided that she loved how the joke had ended. And so we leave them there, in the warm room by the water, proof that the coldest roads can still lead somewhere kind, that dignity taken can be rebuilt, and that the truest wealth in this life is not power or gold, but a door that opens for you and a hand that holds on. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the new stories we bring you every day. Tell us in the comments how this story made you feel. Whether Margot's courage or Cormac's quiet kindness or little Rosie's arrival moved you the most, because we read every comment and we would truly love to hear what your heart has to say. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. We wish you good health, peaceful days, and joy in the small, warm moments of your own life. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.